Hello, everyone. It is December 14th, 2020, and it is 9:20 a.m. Pacific time where I am, and this is the bi-weekly reoccurring meeting for the Inclusive Naming Initiative. My name is Celeste Horgan. I'm a senior technical writer at the CNCF. This is not an official CNCF or LF project, but we do expect that you abide by the usual working agreements and codes of conduct that you might operate under in open source communities. In short, please be wonderful to one another and be kind. In general, we have a few reoccurring topics. Stephen is not here, so I will go over topics earmarked for him. As a general update from the last meeting, what the leads went ahead and did for this project, if you scroll back in the agenda, and I'll just share my screen for the recording's purpose. No, Zoom. No, I don't want to end the meeting. We went through and started categorizing the different types of requests and questions and potential work items based on the last two meetings' notes. And I will quickly go over those shortly. And before I do that, I'm going to, on record, remind everybody that the next meeting for this is January 11th, 2021. So have a lovely break. Now, now let's jump back into the work streams. So I was hoping this would be in an issue by today's meeting. It is not, so it is in the agenda. I will be posting these to the mailing list, and I will be creating a GitHub issue outlining them. So the formal request for this meeting is a request for comment on the potential work streams that we defined. So if you want to take a look at the agenda, they're here. But the project work streams we think are as follows. There's a level for open source software. And the definition of that is a path through the Inclusive Naming Initiative's project and resources specifically for open source project leaders. Broadly speaking, earmarked for that is myself and Stephen and probably Ed, because we have fairly deep knowledge in that. And the next work stream is a company level work stream, which is very similar to the OSS, but it's resources specifically for company leaders looking to enact this kind of change in open source software. We are looking for leads for this work stream in particular. I work in open source full time, so I'm not a great candidate. So I'm thinking maybe after this, let's loop back around and talk about who would be interested in leading. Next level is sort of engaging with standards bodies. And this is a slightly different work stream. It's a path through and resources for people who have to work in depth with standards bodies organizations, but it's also how do we work with them to get the changes that we need pushed through so that projects can then take those changes as upstream. Before I keep going, do we have any questions so far?
Just to clarify, Celeste, on there, you're seeing alignment that if organizations are already doing some work with standard bodies, you're just trying to have it aligned, not necessarily go and knock on the door of the standards bodies ourselves per se.
Do you want to start, Ed?
Yeah, go ahead, Ed. I thought that
so as a personal matter, I think actually we need direct involvement by the various standards bodies and an active, proactive involvement by the standards bodies in this effort. You know, I think minimally there are three legs to this stool, right? Open source, standards bodies, and the many, many, many other companies who have to do efforts in this area. I'm totally open to the existence of other legs that have not occurred to me. My imagination is as always limited, but those three at least strike me as being critical. And so what I would really like to see is most of us work for companies where we have people who are actually very involved in some of these standards bodies. And I would like to see some of those folks start turning up as well.
To give a bit of flavor to this as well, Andre, we spoke to the IETF prior to the official kickoff of this initiative, just to get a sense of what it might take to work with the standards bodies. And the indication from them was, if we as a community make a recommendation and say we want to push forward with this, it then can kind of influence their process in a positive way. And their process, like, we're not going to shortcut or kind of dictate to them what they're going to do. That's just not how standards bodies work. So I think this is a slightly different work stream than the other two, in that it's figuring out how to best interface with that existing process, and understanding that anything we do with standards bodies is going to have a lead time of a year, if not longer. And holding a bit of serenity for that. Does that answer your question?
Okay. No, that's great. I agree. It was good to clarify.
Yeah.
I mean, I tend to view it a little more aggressively, which is I'm respectful of the fact that they have different culture and process, but I'm not willing to spot them a year.
Okay. So this is another area that we're kind of looking for like leadership and involvement in. And the next step here is, now that we've kind of defined these different work streams, we are going to want people to start taking leadership roles in them, simply because there are not enough hours in the day for all of us to do this full time.
So I wanted to just jump in and say, Ed, I'm meeting with Molly from Cisco today. And so if they join into this initiative, maybe they'll be a good fit for.
That would be fantastic.
Yep.
Okay. Nice. Amazing.
Celeste, a quick process question,
Sure.
which segues from what you were saying. So when people want to volunteer for one of these work streams, either as a leader or as a member of the body, where and how do you want that to start happening?
That is a really great question. So what I'm going to do after this meeting is I'm going to dump these work streams into a GitHub issue, because that'll kind of give us a nice locus for discussion and comment. I will then post the GitHub issue to the mailing list. My preference is leave a comment on the GitHub issue saying, like, my name is X, I want to do Y. And the goal here is to start building out like a project board. But we also just wanted to make sure we had alignment on the work streams before we went ahead with that. Thanks for asking.
Celeste, I owe the GitHub issue. I'll take care of that after this meeting.
Okay. Hi, Steven.
Hi. Sorry, y'all. I was working on a CV earlier today and needed to take some downtime. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I saw you tweeting at like 2 a.m. my time, and I was like, I'm going to go through these work streams. Okay.
It's highly leveraged at this point in terms of time.
Yeah. Do you want to kind of take a back seat, or do you want, and let me keep going through these, or do you want to take over, Stephen?
No, go for it. Go for it. You're in the driver's seat right now.
Okay. So the next work stream, and we've kind of tagged Carla for this, which is around intake. And the definition of this is a new company or open source project, etc., is joining the initiative, which is awesome and we love. And just like a lot of you in this group, there's typically been some work done already, and it's how do we surface that work through the initiative? Can we surface that work through the initiative? Is it like a donation of resources? Is it something that has to keep living in that existing company? And then where do we have to funnel people to make their efforts best reflected? So it's a kind of onboarding / resource siphoning work stream, and figuring out how we do that most efficiently. Because right now we have a ton of resources and they all kind of overlap a little bit. And that's what we're trying to avoid. Okay. So this is one that's maybe a little more internal, but it's good to surface here, which is there's some admin work that we need to do, which is kind of managing the website. I believe we have to transfer a DNS domain. And actually, I believe today's the day when we transfer it because it's exactly
Yay!
it's exactly 60 days out now. There's moderation in the mailing list, tooling maintenance, YouTube things, etc. So this is really just the nuts and bolts of keeping this particular thing running. There's a marketing work stream, which I believe realistically in my mind is very much in Priyanka and Bill Mulligan's wheelhouse, which is spreading the word about this, advertising, content production, press, blog, social recruitment, and effectively how do we start celebrating people for getting involved with this initiative. I'm going to come back. Sorry?
Yes, absolutely. We can totally take that on. And Jen Clore, who some of you have met, is going to help us on the PR side too.
Right. I'm going to come back to project governance because I actually have a little question mark around this. And then, of course, last but not least, there is the language work stream, which is pretty much what I'm going to head up. And this is actually around taking in definitions, doing the research around them, making recommendations for alternatives, and gathering consensus, / figuring out what alternatives need to exist based on different use cases. So this is the nuts and bolts of the actual language. So Dale had a question about this on the mailing list. And this is just a general question, which is around project governance and how we actually want to run ourselves, whether we want to do governance kind of per work stream, or whether we want to have to organize ourselves as a larger initiative first. And I would love to hear any thoughts anyone has on this.
I think Celeste, I'm just going to throw out one of the first questions we talked a little bit is about the scope, and I think that's going to impact the project governance. If it's tightly defined, it might have some central governance and then just sub work streams. But if we have a broad kind of amorphous approach to it, then there may be governance that occurs within each of the individual work streams. And I don't know if we've kind of settled in roughly what we see as the first step in the scope.
That's a great point. I'm like anti-governance in general. I just don't like rules. So my instinct is to go with kind of a lighter governance model, especially at first. And if we get to a point where we need to manage ourselves on a work stream by work stream basis, then I think we cross that bridge when we come to it, rather than saying like, every work stream has to have like X and Y officers,
It's often very helpful to remember why you have governance.
Yeah.
Governance exists to provide fair resolution to disputes. That's why you have it. And generally speaking, that's the most important thing to keep in mind as you're trying to figure out how much governance you need, what you need for governance, and everything else. So that's typically been a really good heuristic to start with. It's very, very helpful to have something up front, because trying to figure out how to resolve disputes when you have active disputes is really not a healthy dynamic. But that's often a healthy way to think about the problem.
So yeah, so my general feeling here is that we would try to basically what Celeste said, have some loose overarching governance for the initiatives, but kind of have the individual work streams self-organize and report out. There are going to be some general things that we are interested in, especially when the language work stream kicks up and we are interested in how a specific term might be handled across a specific work stream. So I kind of see these work streams, if you squint and look at them as if they were Kubernetes SIGs, there are some vertical work streams, which I would consider to be the company open source project and standards bodies work streams. And then there are kind of some process-based or kind of program management work streams that cut across all of these. So marketing, the governance language, of course, intake and administration, that kind of cross cuts over everything. So hopefully we lay down some good rules within those work streams and let them kind of flow out into the vertical ones.
Yeah. Okay. So those are the work streams and roughly the themes that we're thinking around working on. In general, any questions and comments? Did you think that we missed anything? More feedback.
Which work stream is going to deal with the onboarding experience of new members to the mailing list, especially enterprise members?
That is going to be intake, I think.
Okay.
It's an astute point, though, because companies often require a different touch than sort of the amorphous blob of open source or standards. They're just used to interacting differently.
There's the
Yeah.
company level work stream, which would have a role.
All right, Jason, I didn't quite hear what you said.
Well, one of the work streams that is listed here is the company level work stream. And
Yes, yeah.
dealing with the path for companies.
And Dale and Jason, I also put that on the agenda to talk a little bit about the enterprise side of it.
Yeah, because I do think we need that. A couple clients met with me this month, and I said they wanted to collaborate with me on this, and I said they're large clients, more conservative, and I said we have inclusive naming. You should join the mailing list, and they were a little bit hesitant. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good topic for us, when we get to the next agenda point to kind of bring.
Yeah. But I think if we cover that and how, what that experience is and how do you help folks engage, I think that would be good. And if Andre, you're going to cover that, that'll be great as well.
Yeah, and this is Demetrius from GitHub. We're having the same experience as well, is that everyone's coming to us to figure out what we're doing, and we're trying to push them here so that we're, we're trying to only do this once.
Exactly.
Do it once.
Do it once.
And it sounds like the right thing to do will be to have folks like you, Demetrius, and Carla, of course, representing Dale, to be on that work stream specifically because you understand that so much better.
Yeah. What I asked one of them to do is actually walk through the experience with me, the website. Let's do a walkthrough and get their reaction.
Yeah.
So we could feed it back into how we would refine it, if you will, right? So it's more consumable, because I think it's great if you're in the open source world. People just figure stuff out, but enterprises, it's not quite the same user experience that many of them are used to. Yeah.
Well, maybe Dale, just kind of pivoting off that and just jumping into what I had proposed to the agenda point. I agree, same thing, just in informal conversations with other enterprise companies who are asking in a much broader scope, training, HR, IT, not just open source type of how do we go about this? To me, I think there's somewhat parallel paths. We've been kind of having some informal discussions with different teams along those lines who maybe are more conservative, not necessarily want to have it all shared, but I think there's a natural intersection where, especially sharing what are the agreed upon replacements. And I think this effort right here, and much more of a public and kind of community driven, we can define kind of that exchange between those two. What words do we want to take a look at that are in scope or out of scope? Kind of where I think, Carla and Dale were talking about last time, and, what are some of our agreements of replacements, or, what are some of the things that are acceptable? Is master plan or master data something that we all think we want to, continue to use? And, since we have the website and have ability to kind of publish that and share that out, I think you're right. You're going to have enterprise questions that are asking everything from how do they support their suppliers? How do they work with their own internal content, outside of just software driven? And a chance for kind of different groups to work together, in terms of sharing that information.
Agreed. Yeah, all of those things have come up. For those who didn't start with a strong governance structure, like us, we were sort of internal open source. We are quickly discovering that we need to figure out, at the enterprise level, what does it mean to get people consensus we get, but then when people decide they don't agree, what are the, what actions are the right actions to take, and how far do you take it? And I know Jason, Deb Bryant had approached me about this in one of the open source communities, right, where we saw somebody from IBM who was resistant. And I think it's an issue we will have to deal with in the open source world as well. We might say, okay, this person's a troll, but if they're a significant contributor and they completely, conscientiously object to this, sometimes in a good way, some constructive way, sometimes in a, let's say, an intimidating way, what do we do with that? Because even though it's not, that type of an issue is something we are going to have to figure out how we address with the right balance inside of a company's or in open source, I think.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, Dale. I was thinking about that during this conversation, and for us, that particular incident for us at Red Hat made us think we need to provide some training to people who are advocates of this idea, who want to start doing this work in a given open source community. So training on what's the best way to propose this. How do you start the conversation? How do you react to objections? Things like that. So I'm trying to think, what work stream does this fit into? But what you and Andre are both saying resonates a lot with me, that I'd like to help in this area.
So for now, I'm putting this under open source because I think you're bringing up like a really interesting kind of piece of content that needs to be created. And I just want to make sure that we capture it. But I agree with you in that it's maybe got some broader applications. Regardless, it's captured, and that was kind of my priority here.
Unless the sharing screen has stopped, just FYI.
Yeah,
I think, by the way, I think it's something that this is kind of one of those programming management things that needs to be understood and filtered throughout all of the work streams. We should be able to handle this in all of the vertical work streams.
Agreed.
I think a lot
Do you
of
mind?
people will have things to.
Oh, I was just asking, Stephen, can you just so I understand, double click on that a little bit? You're saying that all of the work streams will think about implications beyond code, like, for example, how are folks talking to HR teams, things like that? Is that what you're saying?
So I think that each of the work streams will have to deal with, or each of the vertical ones at least, will have to deal with kind of how do we make the case, how do we do onboarding, how do we work on conflicts, all of that stuff. So I think there are general questions that need to be answered, but the answers might be different in each of the work streams. So like maybe this is a governance-y type thing, maybe this is program management-y type thing, but it's a question that needs to be asked and answered for each of the work streams.
And certainly there will be things in common. And so I think one of the roles that these vertical work streams can play is, voicing those particular concerns to the work streams that, deal more generally with the topics. And so we can I'm sure there'll be a lot to share, but we'll be able to kind of make sure we're representing different groups' needs and what works for them.
That makes sense. So perhaps one of the points to add to each of the relevant work streams would be required representation from A, B, and C.
Okay.
Just a suggestion.
Yeah, if somebody wants to add that, that'd be lovely. Do we have any more comments and questions around work streams? Going once, going twice. All right, I'm going to move on to some of the open discussion items. We don't have a ton, so I think we're in good shape. Intel is going to push out presenting on the work that they're doing around open source and standards and developing organizations here. They're pushing out to January 11th, which I think is totally okay. We had another note in here from Karthik, but looking at both the subject of it and knowing that Karthik is also about a part of Kubernetes working group naming, I suspect he put it in the wrong agenda, so I quietly moved it for him. Andre, do you want to talk?
Well, we just were talking a little bit about that. You know, as I said, similar to Dale, I've had a chance to talk to a number of other companies and just informal meetings in our own working group, and looking for possible alignments of how those efforts can align with what we're talking about here, the inclusive naming, in terms of either scope or working to have common definitions of some of the terms and the replacements. And I think that there's an area to explore. What I'm going to ask kind of our working group is just for some ideas and some proposals to come back of how maybe we can partner in some of the areas, to really drive to some common voice in the industry, as well as continuing to share some of the best practices for enterprises and, some of the internal when, as Dale said, when companies approach us and say, how are you doing this? What is the best way to approach that we can provide some guidance.
Okay, so if you had to have your top 3 wish list of things to go back with, what would that look like right now?
I think there's a lot of question, and the things where I'm interested is guidance in what terms do we think are in scope, right? So if a software company showed up today and said, what are the list of words that people should be remediating? Do we have some guidance on those?
Yep.
Different companies, if you look across, different companies have different in scope and out of scope.
Okay.
Common replacements that we all feel are given a domain. So that do we have some agreement that these are things, even along the standards bodies, there's not everybody's on the same page. We may have different alternatives, but driving towards common type of, given this phrase in this context, here's the preferred one, and then also beginning to say, what are some of the things that as collective body we've defined, and Dale, you can add to this, that are in scope. I think the example that you gave, like master data, is the one I use, which is, okay, we've all looked at it with some guidance, and collectively, this is deemed, we don't need to change this. We don't need to remediate this particular one. And beginning to have that list, it's not necessarily authoritative, but it's, enough people have come together to share that. I think that would be a valuable asset for, all of the participants as well as other companies that are interested.
Okay. I think that's super interesting. Okay. And the reason I asked you, just FYI, is a part of me is thinking ahead to kind of what is the first steps that we take.
Yeah.
So hearing your priorities is very helpful in that regards. We have, I think, about 10 minutes left. So are there any final questions or comments? We've hit the end of our agenda.
Hello, my name is Monica Rush, and I work at Microsoft, and I'm working with Andre, and I'm really interested in joining this group and helping this group. So I basically just wanted to introduce myself and felt like I wanted to listen at this first meeting to get my bearings, but I'm very interested, perhaps Celeste helping you with language. As Andre
would be lovely. I would absolutely welcome that. What do you do at Microsoft, just so I know?
So I work on the documentation team for the cloud and AI technologies.
Yes. Slider. No, that's super exciting. I would love your help, 100%. It's really exciting to see Microsoft in the room as well.
Yeah, no. It's this is a important part of the equation. I do want to say that we sort of hurried and make some initial updates because of the change, the branch change. Oh, I don't think that's my background. Okay. We had to sort of hurry and make some initial, the background change from master to main, the branch names in GitHub. I'd be happy to share the guidelines that we came up with, but
yeah,
a little background someplace.
Yeah.
But, okay. Anyway, and so, but what I did want to say is that the work of this group is critical, as a critical piece of the equation, I think, to Microsoft. So what we did initially in order to vet the term changes from master slave, allow list and, or, blacklist, whitelist, we did consult a very broad group within Microsoft, everything from the open source champs to the marketing teams, to the engineering teams, etc. So we did some vetting that I think could sort of validate term candidates that we bring to this group. But then we also we have a global diversity and inclusion team, and they always consult like the appropriate demographic groups. So I'm not suggesting that terms I would bring here would be, conclusive in any way, but I would like to think that we did a fair amount of vetting so that, if I helped you, Celeste, on the language part, that we had done some of the spade work. Do you know what I mean? To feel, maybe we were moving in the right direction. But this, to me, again, although I feel pretty good about the term changes that we've made so far, it's just a small set. And this is a critical piece of the equation, this group, to really feel like you've validated things in the right way.
Yeah, and I mean, so as a part of the Kubernetes naming working group, we did actually evaluate Microsoft's changes as well. So it's good to hear how you made those changes, because that's also an interesting aspect. Like in Kubernetes, we were focused on how do we create a process that open source project can keep forever, regardless of the presence of the working group or not. But Microsoft is a company with that has larger resources to do things like seeking out specific demographic groups and asking them for that kind of feedback. So that's also an interesting aspect. I'm very excited to work with you. Thank you for showing up.
We have resources that other teams don't have. We should be exploiting those resources for the benefit of this group. That's what I think.
100%.
That was, so that perfectly said. That was something that I was about to bring up next. I think that I'm super excited to see everyone who hops onto the mailing list and they're like, hi, nice to meet you. I'm so-and-so. I work at Foo Place. I think the next iteration of that is making sure that the introductions are useful. Like, tell us why you're here. Tell us what you want to do. If you have information already, dump it on the group and give us an idea of like, how can that information be useful, or how have we already started implementing that in my company or my standards body or my open source project, right? So that's and I see that as part of the intake. How can we turn that into something that's actionable or usable for all of the people in this initiative?
Okay. Oh, and I guess I'd like to add that I'm not appropriately dressed, so I don't have video on. I will have video on January 11th, for the record.
Okay, don't worry about it. Again, poor Stephen was up working at like 2 o'clock Pacific time, which I think is about 5 for him in New York. So it happens. Yeah. You're not the only one with video off today. So are there any last comments or questions?
Yeah, Celeste, Jim St. Ledger, I have one. So some folks may be aware there's a somewhat parallel effort called SDDI, Software Developer Diversity and Inclusion. And that's, similar to this event, it's been in discussion. There's a lot of folks, if you're familiar with the CHAOSS group, Community Health, and I forget what the rest of CHAOSS stands for, but somebody knows. And they've sort of formalized it into a team. They had an announcement, I think, that lined up, if I remember right, around KubeCon-ish timing. They had a meeting last week about, okay, what are the different vectors of diversity and inclusion we're going to work? And one of them, no surprise, is inclusive naming. And Kate Stewart's running that effort along with a few other folks. And my very strong suggestion was we don't need a second effort on inclusive naming. We just need to work with this team and sort of view that broader diversity inclusion work as a partnership with this team, being the one that takes the lead on inclusive naming. So as always, because I opened my mouth, I got nominated to be the coordinator between the two groups. Folks know how that goes. So I will just, from time to time, I will probably try to bring in some kind of update from this work into that team and vice versa to the degree it makes sense.
That would be wonderful. Just you don't even have to ask, drop it in the agenda whenever you have an update. And I will do my best to set up the agenda before the next meeting. So yeah, don't even ask. I definitely want to know what's going on with them as well.
So as a note, Priyanka, Kate, Demetris, and Dale and myself kind of poked around, and we were on a panel for Open Source Summit, and yeah, that is definitely one of the goals, to make sure that we're cross connecting between these two groups and sharing information. So.
Yep. All right.
And I'll post, for those who aren't familiar with it, I'll post the link into the chat session and I'll add it into the minutes as well. So
yes, please, into the minutes would be wonderful. Okay. So everybody's action item coming out of this meeting is, once the GitHub issue is posted on GitHub and posted on the mailing list, please carefully review the work streams to make sure that the thing you are most passionate about is being covered. And if you don't feel that it is, ask a question or make a suggestion as to which work stream you think it needs to be in. That is your action item number 1, everyone. Action item number 2 is sign up to be a part of a specific work stream. The work that gets done is the work that gets committed to and the work that has people attached to it. So please attach yourself to some work.
Can we get everyone to mute, please?
Yeah, there's what I can only assume is
kettle or a kid.
A kettle, a child, or a bird. Okay.
That sounds like a new Zoom drinking game.
Oh no.
Oh dear.
Yeah, that could be fun.
All right.
Celeste, if I can interject for a second. So I see lots of great things happening on the chat. As a note, I love that everyone's introducing themselves to each other. As a note, Zoom chat will get lost. So if you have a specific question or an ask of the group, either send it to the mailing list, or now we also have the Inclusive Naming GitHub org has an org repo where you can open issues if you have questions. So just either drop them in the mailing list and we'll collate them and bring them into that org repo, or open an issue directly there so we don't lose that thread.
100%. Also, as a side note, I never look at the chat when I'm leading a meeting. So it's falling on deaf ears, unfortunately. I apologize. So we're almost at the hour. I think I'm going to call this. Please look out for the mailing list for the GitHub issue around work streams, and please leave your comments, questions, and volunteering. All right, everybody, I'm gonna stop recording in 3, 2, 1.
And let's just give it a minute or two for people to grab stuff from the chat.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining.